Welcome back, everybody, to our second panel. I'm delighted to introduce Mary Morgan, who is the Albert Hirschman Professor at London School of Economics and is currently working on narratives and performity and how ideas can shape our economic performance. Just to remind everybody that we have a chat function here. So if you type in questions that you would like to ask either specific speakers or the panel in general, then I'm sure Mary will pick those up and come back to them during the questions and answers session. So Mary, over to you.
Thank you very much, Angus. So I'm very pleased to be chairing this session on evolutionary macroeconomics. I'd like to thank also David Wilson for putting the session together. We have three speakers. David, who is the Distinguished Professor Emeritus at Binghampton University and President of Pro-Social World, which is a spin-off of the Evolution Institute designed to catalyze positive cultural change in real-world settings. That's a quote. His latest books are This View of Life, Completing the Darwinian Revolution, and his first novel, Atlas Hugged. Second speaker is Kate Raworth, who describes herself as a renegade economist. I'm looking forward to finding out what that means. Focused on exploring the economic mindset needed to address the 21st century's social and ecological challenges. She's the creator of the Doughnut of Social and Planetary Boundaries, and a research associate at Oxford University's Environmental Change Institute, and a professor of practice at Amsterdam University of Applied Sciences. Our third speaker, I hope I've got the order right now, is Joe Henrich, who's professor and chair of Human Evolutionary Biology at Harvard University, held tenured faculty positions in economic psychology and anthropology, and we'll be talking, his talk today will draw on his two most recent books, The Secret of Our Success and The Weirdest People in the World. So I'm going to run the session with each speaker having 20 minutes, and then we'll have a short interlude between the speakers, and then I'll open the questions up to the ones that come through the chat function. So I'd like to ask David to set us going, please. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. So exciting to be here. Such a privilege to be working with the SRC's Rebuilding Macroeconomics program. And kudos to the speakers of the previous panel, including Dennis and Henrietta, who are I think, here with us today. Their talks are very conciliant with I think, this panel. Okay, so it was Thorstein Veblen who first asked that question, why is economics not an evolutionary science? And if you read that paper, it is amazingly current. In fact, some of these passages that I'm about to quote, I think could have been tweets promoting this conference. Here he is on the scientific standing of the economics profession. It may be taken as the consensus of those men who are doing the serious work of modern anthropology, ethnology, and psychology, as well as those within the biological sciences proper, that economics is helplessly behind the times and unable to handle its subject matter in a way to entitle it to standing as a modern science. And here he is on the economic conception of human nature and all of the received formulations of economic theory. The human material with which the inquiry is concerned is conceived in hedonistic terms. That is to say, in terms of a passive and substantially inert and immutably given human nature. The hedonistic conception of man is that of a lightning calculator of pleasure and pains. And then he goes on in one of the most famous passages in economics. In contrast, he describes economic action as a product of cultural evolution. So this enables me to showcase Joe's presentation, which is about to, and new book, which we're about to hear. The economic life history of the individual is a process of adaptation, of means to ends that cumulatively change as the process goes on, both the agent and his environment being at any point the outcome of the past process. His methods of life today are forced upon him by his habits of life carried over from yesterday, and by the circumstances left as the mechanical residue of the life of yesterday. And one more, the indeterminate nature of economic action. Economic action is teleological in the sense that men always and everywhere seek to do something. What in specific detail they seek is not to be answered except by a scrutiny of the details of their activity. But so long as we have to do with their life as members of the economic community, there remains the generic fact that their life is an unfolding activity of a teleological kind. So in modern terms, what Veblen was saying, and what we are saying also, is that economic action is an ongoing process of cultural evolution at the scale of whole systems at the macro level. And the parameters of the lower level systems making up the macroeconomic system are not fixed. They vary, and they provide the malleability needed for system level selection. And Jason Potts's talks, all of the preceding talks, including Jason's, make this message just as well as I can, or the members of this panel. Well, Veblen's article did not have much of an impact on the economics profession, and we had to wait until 1982 for the next landmark, for the next milestone. That was Nelson and Winter's evolutionary theory of economic change. That initiated a school of thought within economics called evolutionary economics. But the most important thing to say about it is that it was premature. I'm unpacking a lot of social history into this slide, but suffice it to say that the study of evolution, my field of evolution, was very largely restricted to genetic evolution for most of the 20th century, had essentially nothing to say about culture. That was relegated to other disciplines in the human and behavioral and social sciences. And it was only during the 1970s, the same decade that Nelson and Winters coined the term evolutionary economics, that other terms such as evolutionary psychology, evolutionary anthropology were being coined, signifying that only then, in the closing decades of the 20th century, were people beginning to rethink entire disciplines from an evolutionary perspective. And even my own discipline of evolution was still in the 1980s in the grip of individualism, the same tradition that held economics and actually all of the social sciences in its grip, as if everything social had to be understood in terms of individuals, actions, and motives. And so more had to happen before we could, all of these fields could actually begin to escape the grip of individualism. So the bottom line is that most of the knowledge needed to rethink economics from an evolutionary perspective only became available during the last 30 or so years. And so I think for the first time, it is possible to realize what Veblen very clearly foresaw now 122 years ago. And that's what my project in rebuilding macroeconomics has been about. It's called Managing Evolution, a new narrative for macroeconomics. It has a theory component, which is to work with Dennis to rethink the theoretical foundation of economics. And so proud to have Dennis precede me in this conference. And then it has an action component, which is to actually employ a multi-level approach to revolving a sustainable future in the UK. So the idea of rethinking economics comes naturally to me based on an article I wrote with the other Wilson, E.O. Wilson, in 2007 called Rethinking the Theoretical Foundation of Sociobiology, where we reintroduced multi-level selection as the foundation for thinking about social evolution in all of its forms, genetic or cultural. And when it comes to rethinking economics, what Dennis and I are dividing that into a number of parts. One is rethinking the purpose of economics, the basic definition, defining what economics is, to rethink the nature of theory, because the way theory is regarded in economics is very different actually from all other major topic domains, including complex systems theory in addition to evolutionary theory. Rethinking methodological individualism big time. This, I think, is the main elephant in the room. Individualism, which is a tradition which includes but extends beyond economics. And then first and foremost, most of all, to actually take all of this theory and develop it in a way that it leads to a practical framework for managing cultural evolution at multiple scales in all topic areas. Again, so happy that the first panel did a lot of my work for me by saying that micro to macro is not good enough. There must be a meso, and it's a two-way street. Macro affects micro just as much as micro affects macro. So for rethinking the purpose of economics, here's the old definition: the study of how people use scarce resources to satisfy their unlimited desires. And what Dennis, this is actually Dennis's formulation, but I think it's one that I think is being very commonly embraced. The discipline whose purpose is to promote the mobilization of material resources in the pursuit of human well-being. We might tinker with the wording there, but I think the most important point there is how holistic it is, that we're trying to basically evolve whole human systems for well-being. And this enables me to presage Kate's talk following mine, and her holistic conception of donut economics, which includes the planetary boundaries, the ecological ceiling, we can't go beyond those, social foundations, and we need to be in that middle range, the safe and just space for humanity. This should be the domain of economics. And so when it comes to rethinking theory, let's begin with the Oxford definition: a supposition or system of ideas intended to explain something, especially one based on general principles independent of the thing to be explained. Notice no mention of math. Darwin's theory is cited as the exemplar of a theory. That was articulated by Darwin entirely without math. And of course, math is important. And of course, math is mathematical models, vibrant theorizing in evolutionary science. But it plays a much, much more humble role than formal mathematical models in economic theory, and always in conjunction with empirical research. So I think that just taking the way that theory is conceptualized in evolutionary science and complex systems science, basically all the other sciences, makes full use of formal models, but also puts them in their place as part of a dialectic for understanding the reality. Now, once again, Dennis did a lot of my work for me here, that the analysis of living systems must focus on units of functional organization, which is sometimes the individual organism, but not always. Units of functional organization depend upon levels of selection in genetic and cultural evolution. And group selection has been a strong force in human evolution. What sets us apart from other primate species is the degree to which selection operates at the group levels, selecting for cooperative units. This took place originally at a small scale, not just small hunter-gatherer groups, but also the tribal scale for genetic evolution, and then gene-culture coevolution, and then at progressively larger scales for cultural evolution over the last 10,000 years, with many reversals along the way. This is not a smooth progression. This is like a tug of war between levels of selection, with lower levels of selection, those disruptive lower levels of selection that Dennis mentioned in his talk, often winning the day. So there's real tension and drama as to which level, the balance between levels of selection. And that means that economic action needs to be a form of cultural evolution in which all three ingredients of an evolutionary process, the target of selection, variation oriented around the target, and the replication of best practices, need to be managed with systemic goals in mind. That's what economic action needs to be. And something else emphasized by an evolutionary approach is the importance of small social groups. And in our entire evolutionary history, individuals never lived alone. They always functioned in the context of small cooperative groups. And this dependency is baked into our brains and bodies. The degree to which we are members of small groups, and in the same way that ants are members of ant colonies, is something which still needs to be appreciated actually across all of the social and behavioral sciences. And so what this means is that creating a cellular level of human society where the cells are the small groups where people work with each other in order to get things done. Each and every one of us participates in many of these cellular level groups will have two benefits. First, it will vastly improve individual well-being. And in the second, it will allow efficacious action at a larger scale, but only if those cells are appropriately structured. It's paradoxical that even though in some sense we're adapted to live in small groups, that does not mean that small groups automatically function well. And here's where Elinor Ostrom comes in for the core design principles that she identified for common pool resource groups, what they needed to function well. Those principles can be generalized from an evolutionary perspective. Essentially, the products of cooperation in all their forms are a form of common pool resource vulnerable to exploitation. And so that means that these core design principles, along with auxiliary design principles, are applicable to all contexts and all scales. And they can be used as a practical coaching method. This is something we could really do in a policy sense, starting at the cellular level. Here's just a little bit of research on this. A paper that compared business groups with other kinds of groups. And very simply, the bottom line is that business groups as cooperative units need these core design principles as well as any other kind of group. The better you implement the core design principles, the better you perform as a group. And that top graph, the red lines are, the blue lines are business groups. The red lines are any other kind of group. They fall along the same line, but businesses extend lower on the line. In other words, on average, business groups are deficient in all of the core design principles, with the biggest deficits in local autonomy. In other words, most people aren't allowed to do their jobs as they see fit. Decision-making, many people in their jobs are not part of the decision-making process. And meaning and purpose, many people don't think that their jobs are doing meaningful work. I think the deficit of businesses is due in large part to the influence of orthodox economics, which basically provides a lens that causes you to see things in such a different way that the core design principles, which are common sense from an evolutionary perspective, become invisible or baffling or seemingly wrong-headed from another theoretical perspective. The theory decides what can be deserved. So our practical effort to manage cultural evolution is now, this is my new startup, ProSocial, where we attempt to take these powerful ideas and actually put them into action. And the Rebuilding Economics grant enabled us to work in the UK. My colleagues here are James Dyke, who's a complex systems theorist at the University of Exeter, and Paul Atkins, which is ProSocial World's chief trainer. And what we did was we organized an online facilitation course, training course, a facilitator training course, which took place before the pandemic began and thankfully survived the pandemic. And the course itself was a multi-level with 4 tiers. Individuals took the course, but they were members of small teams, and those teams represented organizations, and then those organizations could interact with each other. So the course itself was a multi-level course, and this proved to be very, very powerful. And on the right, I've listed the organizations that were involved. ACBS is a scientific and practitioner society with over 8,000 members worldwide. We worked with the whole association, plus with chapters in Bristol and Dumfries. The Banking Standards Board is an amazing organization. C40, Megacities, Circle Economy. Kate wonderfully brought in quite a few of these organizations and participated with her Doughnut Economics Action Lab. And it was wonderful to have the RSA and the Transition Town Network, which originated in the UK and is a movement that has spread all around the world. And what we're working on together combines bottom up with what I like to call enlightened top down. The organizations that we work with are in a position to provide access to groups. And then we work at the cellular level of single groups to make them more efficacious as cooperative units and more adaptable to change. Becoming more adaptable to change is something which is important, and I don't have time to cover in this talk. It's actually a component of pro-social, along with the core design principles that makes groups more adaptable. And to use these same principles to improve between group interactions in addition to within group interactions. The wonderful thing about the core design principles is that they're scale independent, needed for between group interactions, no less than within group interactions. And then a final important point is to not just do this in an in and out fashion, but to cultivate long-term relationships to evolve the societal equivalent of an anatomy, physiology, and nervous system. I think the previous talks in the previous panel were actually driving at the need to do that with such concepts as rules that Jason Potts was emphasizing. But I think that we can make more progress with this if we truly take the concept of society as an organism, a metaphor with a venerable history, seriously as something that can be a fact and that can be worked towards if it does not currently exist. So to summarize, Veblen's question, why is economics not an evolutionary science, as timely now as in 1898? Only now are we in a position to act upon it. This requires a lot of theoretical rethinking. I mean, frankly, it's paradigmatic. And I think what's encouraging about this conference is that there's a critical mass of people that are operating within the new paradigm, that it can take on its own life and it can basically liberate itself from the previous paradigm, and also leads to a practical framework for managing cultural evolution in real world settings, multiple scales, all cultures, all topic areas. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, David. That was great, wonderful timing. So I'm turning over now to Kate, please.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here on this panel and indeed in this conference. I'm going to just dive straight in. So I'm going to talk about the donut concept, which David has generously introduced, and how we can downscale it and positioning it in systems change. So the 21st century, what's happened with my... The 21st century has kicked off with multiple crises. 2008 financial meltdown, we live in an era of climate and ecological breakdown, and now we are enduring COVID lockdown. And economic policymakers, at the very least, are asking themselves, in the light of these recurring crises, what is it we're aiming for? And I think we recognize that these crises and others are emerging from the very systems that we've created. The endless expansion that's built into the systems that we have result in crises that they're like feedback loops from endlessly attempting to expand. So how do we reorient ourselves? And talking about the teleological points of Veblen, I offer this donut as a concept. I like that David was saying that Darwin didn't write his theory down in an equation, but he did draw it in the picture. In his notebook, he drew a little branching tree. And I think image is incredibly powerful for helping us reconceptualize paradigms and goals. So I offer this image of a donut. The goal here is to leave nobody falling short on the essentials of life in the hole in the middle. But in line with the new definition we were offered of economics, as we use material resources to meet those essential needs and to ensure people's well-being, we don't overshoot the life-supporting systems of our planet, that ecological ceiling. And so we need to find a balance between. And we can see that the 12 social dimensions that are there are drawn from the Sustainable Development Goals. So all the governments in the world have already agreed that all the people in the world have a claim to meeting these essential needs. That gives them an international credibility in terms of where they've sourced from. And then the ecological ceiling comes from Earth system science, from Johan Rockstrom, Will Steffen, and others' work on defining planetary boundaries as the life-supporting systems of the planet. So this gives us a very, very different shape of what progress and well-being looks like from the 20th century predominant metaphor of endless growth. And in fact, I find it fascinating that this shape, which has a sense of thriving in balance, a dynamism, it actually harks back to and somehow echoes the image of what well-being looks like in many, many ancient cultural symbols, whether it's Taoist yin yang, Maori takarangi, the Buddhist endless knot, the Celtic double spiral. So if this is the goal, and this is one articulation of a goal of what human well-being looks like, meeting the needs of all people within the means of the living planet, the question is, first of all, where are we now? To use Joe's phrase, these outcomes are the outcomes of past processes. Right now, we are massively falling short on meeting the needs of billions of people worldwide. All of that red in the center shows the extent to which people are falling short on food, for example. That little red wedge goes 11% of the way to the middle of the circle, because 11% of people worldwide don't have enough food to eat every day. But there's shortfall in every area. Some of it, it's the deprivation in the global north, but much of it is deprivation in the global south. At the same time as that enduring human deprivation, we have massively overshot at least 4 of these planetary boundaries on climate change, but also on critical biodiversity loss, on excessive fertilizer use and land conversion. So you could say that this is the 21st century selfie of humanity. This is our collective challenge. And I sincerely believe our children's children will look back and judge us for what we did once we had seen this, once we knew, because we now know. So we can downscale. Once I first published a version of that Doughnut in 2012, people immediately said, can we downscale to where we are? And some brilliant researchers at Leeds University, Andrew Fanning, Dan O'Neill, and others, created 150 downscale doughnuts using internationally comparable data. So it's never quite as sensitive to a national context as you want it to be, but it tells us a very clear story across countries. You've got Rwanda massively falling short on people's needs without overshooting any of those ecological ceilings. Australia almost meeting the needs of all people. Of course, we know there's a deprivation within, but on an international comparison, it looks good, but massively overshooting on its ecological ceiling. By the way, that overshoot is similar for all high-income countries. And then in the middle, you've got countries like Brazil, like China, and like many middle-income countries that have some both shortfall and overshoot. So all of these countries have very, very different trajectories that they need to pursue to what it means to thrive. And indeed, if we put all 150 countries in this box, we can see that the top left-hand corner is the sweet spot. It means you're meeting the needs of all people on the social threshold, but doing so within the means of the planet. And we can see that there's no country there. So for me, this diagram tells us that we're all developing countries now. There is no country in the world that I'd say could hold its hand up and say we're developed. And you should try to develop like us, because no one's there. So every country has to pursue an unprecedented trajectory that's never been done before. And that, I think, means an extraordinary amount of humility and ambition, both for policymakers, but I think indeed for economists. It's a very exciting time to be an economist if you embrace this new direction and new purpose of what economics should be in service to. So that's at the national level. How could we get into the donut? I want to just reflect on some 20th century theories that told us through the Kuznets curve and the environmental Kuznets curve, it seemed to promise from quite patchy data from very particular moments in time, only capturing part of the pictures. Kuznets himself knew, but those using his work brushed aside. It seemed to tell us that growth will eventually even things up and growth will eventually clean up after itself. But the evidence has come through now that this is not the case. Growth doesn't simply even things up. And growth doesn't clean up after itself. So relying on growth to solve inequalities and pollution is not going to get us there. We need to create systems by design. We need to intervene in the very design and the dynamics, I think, the dynamics that our economies create. So I think there are 2 fundamental dynamics that we need to create economies in service to. One is to move from the degenerative dynamics of take, make, use, lose that runs down the sources of the living world and throws waste into her sinks. Turn from a degenerative to a regenerative format where resources are used again and again, where we work with and within the cycles of the living world. And this is where economics needs to go back to its ancient Greek roots. Economics means the art of household management. How on earth can you presume to manage the household before you begin to understand the household? So I think all economics should begin with ecology. and understanding the life supporting systems of the planet, and indeed begin with humanity and the character of nature of humanity. And that's why I'm so delighted to be on this panel with both Joe and David. So from degenerative to regenerative, but also from dynamics that are centralizing of opportunity and value, and we see through this the rise of a 1%, to dynamics that are far more distributive of opportunity and value. And I saw Diane Elson, one of my heroes, posted a comment in the chat box at the beginning saying, isn't there a problem that ownership is so centralized that we can't possibly implement the kinds of principles that David's talking about? And I just want to say one thing that gives me hope of possibility, and definitely not necessity of change, but possibility of change, is that every industrial system requires at least four key elements: a means of energy, a source of energy, a means of production, a source of communication, and a store of knowledge. And you could say that predominantly in the 20th century, these technologies were centralizing by design. Energy produced in oil rigs and pipelines, production in a Fordist factory where some people own the company and others come in and get wage labor, communications literally through a centralized switchboard, and knowledge since the 1500s in patents and copyrights intended to share ideas, but in fact, we know in pharmaceuticals and electronics used to actually block competitors and collaboration and innovation. So the 21st century is inviting very different dynamics. It's inviting energy to be distributed through renewable networks. It's inviting production that can be desktop, whether it's 3D printing. It's inviting communications that is already a network, in a node in every hand in this seminar, and indeed in this woman in Tanzania's hand. And licensing of Creative Commons and open source design that means we can network. So imagine what would happen if we actually put together the potential of these distributive design technologies. And what kind of economy would be in service to enabling that to actually happen? I think if we could bring up the potential of these, it really deeply challenges the concentration of ownership that we've witnessed in the past. So downscaling the Doughnut. Ever since it was published in 2012, people have wanted to downscale it to place, and I showed it's been downscaled at the national level, but I got together with the brilliant biomimicry thinker Janine Benyus, and we mashed up our ideas together and came up with a framework that we think has sort of polycentric possibilities, that it can be used at multiple levels. And I'm going to introduce it here at the scale of a city, which is the scale we first applied it to with the C40 and with others. So I invite you to think of a city you know of and listen through that lens to these questions. So the question we invite all cities to ask themselves, indeed all places: how can our city be a home to thriving people in a thriving place, while respecting the well-being of all people and the health of the whole planet? And you can hear there are 4 questions embedded in this. So the first question is, what would it mean for the people of our city to thrive? And that question is asked with and by the people of the city. So what are the culture and the norms and the context and the history of the people of a particular place? What from them, in their terms, does thriving mean? And how can we measure how well they're doing against that? And what that would mean would probably be very different in Dar es Salaam or in Stockholm or in a town or in a large megacity. So that's defined by the people of the place. Then we ask, what would it mean for the city to thrive within its natural habitat? Again, this is defined by place because every city, every town is located in a different part of Earth's biomes. And nature has a genius of thriving in different ways in different places on the planet. So how could the city belong in the biome in which it's placed? And this is Janine's work. Go to the wildland next door and ask, how much is the land sequestering carbon dioxide? How much is it storing groundwater after a storm? How much is it cooling the air from the treetops to the forest floor? How much is it housing biodiversity? And what would it mean for the city to aim to match nature's generosity in this place so that humanity would truly belong as part of the ecosystem in which we're embedded? So these two, thriving people, thriving place, are local aspirations. And many places focus on these. Let's have good lives for our people with clean air, clean water, and parks nearby. But we need to go further. We need to recognize every city, every place is located in a web of global relationships, ecological and social. So we also need to ask, what would it mean for our city to respect the well-being of people worldwide, the people who sewed the clothes that we wear, who picked and packed the fruit that we eat, who assembled the electronics that we use every day, who mined the construction materials of the homes we live in. So how is our city, not only through global supply chains, through investment, through all sorts of connections that could be explored, again, sensitive to place and its own context and history, how can we transform those relationships and ensure that we are not undermining the rights, but indeed respecting the rights of those people worldwide? And then again, thinking of all the materials embedded in the food and the electronics and the construction materials and the clothing that are imported into the city. How do we ensure that these are within planetary boundaries? Because we know that a city's consumption impact is far, far beyond its own location. It goes worldwide. So these are the 4 questions that we invite cities and places to ask of themselves. And we can do this at the kind of multi-scale, and this taps into Ostrom's work of sort of polycentric governance, that we're finding that people are wanting to do it at many scales. So the county of Devon is saying we want to do the Doughnut for Devon. Ladywood and Portloop in Birmingham are saying we want to do it at the neighborhood scale. The nation of Costa Rica, the city of Amsterdam. This is my favorite wrapping paper I found in my local stationery store. And I thought, that's it. It's the polycentric Doughnut. And you can do it from the large scale national all the way down to the tiny one. And they all could be nestled within one another. So here's just an image from Ladywood and Portloop, our colleagues at Civic Square in Birmingham, who are working with a local community and using the Doughnut as a concept to begin inquiring, who do we want to be? How do we want to be here? How do we want to belong in the world? And then we've also worked with the city of Amsterdam, who published their city portrait that we created with and for them in April, in the height of the pandemic, in the month in which they had the highest infection rates, actually. And it really triggered a lot of interest internationally. The power of peer-to-peer inspiration. Other cities and places began moving to do this when they saw Amsterdam's published. And we published the methodology by which we've done this to enable others to self-organize and do it themselves too. Here are workshops that we've held in Portland, Philadelphia, and Amsterdam, where we've created these first city portraits. And these are city policy staff and community members sitting around their city portrait with stickers and arrows and lines and dots, making connections and having conversations and seeing a holistic image of the interconnectedness of these 4 lenses that wasn't previously available because they weren't looking at it through this frame. What we're excited about, though, is going from the public portrait, and this is Amsterdam's portrait. It's a series of targets, which are in the dark grey boxes. This is what the city has set for itself as a target, and then statistics reflecting how you're doing against that target in the light grey boxes. But this is just a starting point, like a statistical snapshot of where the city is. What we think is going to be exciting is seeing cities start to make it their city selfie. So layering onto this all the ongoing initiatives that are already bringing about the transformation that's desired, layering onto it the connections between these lenses and seeing the synergies or the tensions that lie between them, bringing in voices from the community of what people value and what people think thriving in this dimension would mean, bringing quotes and lived experience and stories from those communities that show the very, very different experiences, and then bringing in initiatives that people propose or are initiating in the neighborhood of how they could connect across these lenses and create something that wasn't going to happen without taking this more holistic view. So I just want to pull back and use some of the tools of system change to think, what is it we're trying to do here? I'm a fan of Donella Meadows' framework of the leverage points of intervening systems, and she starts at the top with the simplest tweak, and the further down it goes, it becomes more transformative. And I would say, I think the Doughnut sits at the level of, you could say it's changing the goals of the system, or indeed it's changing the paradigm of the system from which it arises. It's changing what we think well-being is, as well as aiming for well-being rather than simply for growth. And we've launched Doughnut Economics Action Lab to enable people to self-organize in doing this. We're an organization of 7 people. We went from 3 to 7 during lockdown, and we want to stay a small organization. Our aim is to create tools that are useful to others in the transformatory work that they're doing. And that means we have to work in such a way that enables others to self-organize and take the tools and make it make sense for themselves in their communities. So these are some photographs of people who were doing it anyway before we formed the Action Lab, just over the last 5 years. People who've popped up and said, well, I'm teaching it anyway because I think it should be on the syllabus. I'm using it in my office. I'm using it in my hotel on the table. We sit at our meeting table around the Doughnut. It helps us think differently. We're using it in our community group. We're using it in our organization. So change makers already in action. We've set up Doughnut Economics Action Lab to create a platform where people can become part of the community and connect and find each other and get inspired by people just like them who are already doing that thing they thought was impossible. We think that's a very important source of where change and inspiration comes from. And we're inviting people to upload their own evolution of the Doughnut. So we've put it into Creative Commons and inviting people to share tools that they've evolved out of it, or indeed stories of how they've implemented it, so that we're going to co-create and learn and continually adapt and evolve these ideas as we go. for us, one of the critical challenges here is to combine this openness of creating open source ideas with integrity. We want people to be able to play with and adapt the ideas, but there's a very high risk that they could be co-opted, greenwashed, downwashed, just assimilated into business as usual, and in the process destroyed. And so we, on the one hand, embrace openness and invite people to engage with the Doughnut of multiple levels of analysis. That's the polycentric governance, multiple tools, bringing together networks of change makers working in iterative cycles of co-creation. And that will have an evolutionary life of its own. But we've also created a set of principles of practice saying, if you want to use the Doughnut concept, we ask that you use it in such a way. You make sure you're inclusive. You are reciprocal. You share back what you create. You respect the big picture of the economy. Will this work? I don't know. This is an evolutionary experiment in itself. So trying to create a new kind of commons of ideas is an experiment. It's probably our biggest experiment. And it's the one that matters most because it's what will enable these ideas to fly, enable people to use them and adapt them to place without losing the integrity with which they're designed. And then lastly, I'll say that coming back to some of the core ideas of Doughnut economics, and I'm reflecting on the sort of methodological individualism that David was talking about. Mainstream economics sees the economy essentially, day one, welcome to economics. It's happening in classrooms all over the world. Welcome to economics, here's supply and demand. As if the market were the economy, as if price were the metric of concern. And that, Mary, is why I think of myself as a renegade economist. I want to be part of the movement that just says, come on, let's start somewhere much smarter than that. Because the danger when we start with the market is who we show up as is rational economic man who stands alone with money in his hand, an ego in his heart, a calculator in his head, and nature at his feet. We show up as consumer or producer. Are you labor or capital? And that's an extraordinarily narrow version of who we are. In the state relationship, we may be a public servant or a resident or a voter and protester, all of them key relationships that we play in relation to the state. In the household, parent, partner, relative, or child, providing that unpaid caring work that makes the essence of the core economy. And in the commons, a volunteer, a sharer, a co-creator, or a steward. And I think what COVID has given us, and so many people have realized the we, the collective we against that me of individualism, the value of that we. But the question is, how do we nurture the skills to be good stewards and co-creators? How do we nurture the skills to be good civic members and to be good household members? How do we embrace all of these economic identities in the reality that we pursue? And that's, again, why I'm so happy to be followed by Joe, because I think his work is helping us open up, recognizing the many kinds of people, and that we're not just one kind of weird identity, but also David's work and bringing Eleanor Ostrom's work into pro-social, turning it into a tool that is essential for people who want to inhabit the commons, expand the commons, as we're aiming to do through our work. We need the tools and skills to make that happen. So I will stop there and very much look forward to hearing Joe's contribution.
So thank you very much, Kate. That was great. And thank you for keeping to time as well. So I'll hand over to Joe.
There we go. I'm just about ready. Get a few things squared away here. All right. Well, it's great to be with you and to be a member of this panel. So I thought what I would do, I'm going to go a little bit of a different direction and try to introduce you to some ideas from my field of cultural evolution, which could help you in rethinking macroeconomics. All right, so I thought I'd 3 ideas, just have 20 minutes. But the first thing I want to illustrate is how we can begin with evolutionary theory and build from micro foundations. So how do we build theories about human behavior and decision-making and learning? So if we want to build formal evolutionary models of cultural evolution, what do we put into the model? How do people learn? How do they acquire ideas, beliefs, and values? Then I'll think about moving to the meso level that David mentioned. So how does this process of learning from other people in your community give rise to social norms and institutions? And then finally, the latest thing I've been working on for the last 10 years is the coevolution of psychology and institutions. So I'll make the case that our minds actually begin to fit with the kind of institutions they need to navigate. So this is in keeping in some ways with how economists think about the world. So institutions create incentives and constraints. And growing up in different institutions from a young age, our brains begin to think in ways that give us affordances or advantages in navigating different institutions. And I'll close by just pointing out that these have large impacts on economic outcomes typically studied by economists. Okay, So I'm going to summarize here in about 2 slides my book, The Secret of Our Success. And the place where we begin is by thinking about genetic evolution. So it's not really a question anymore in science that humans are a kind of animal. We evolved by processes, the same processes that used to explain the rest of the natural world. We're very much apes. There's a large number of things about humans you can understand by just recognizing we're a type of ape. I'm going to make use of that in a few minutes when I talk about the evolution of families. Knowing we're a type of ape is going to be important. But then we can also think about how we learn from others by applying the logic of natural selection and thinking about how human minds have evolved to most effectively extract ideas, beliefs, and values from the minds of others to adaptively extract these ideas. And this is a highly formalized endeavor. So these are formal evolutionary models, go back into the 1970s, that say when we should use different kinds of learning, the kinds of cues we should pay attention to, like success or prestige or certain kinds of content, which I'll say more about in a minute. But then in thinking about the products of cultural evolution, we also have to take into account the rest of our ape biology. So just to give you a quick sense of how this works, I mentioned we can think about what we call who cues. So these are who people should pay attention to. Some individuals in your cultural milieu and the social world you interact in are more likely to have useful information. If you can figure out how to find those individuals, you can preferentially learn all kinds of things from them. I'll say more about what you can learn. You can also use cues of similarity. So there seems to be evidence that people will tend to copy those who match themselves on things like sex and ethnicity, because those are likely to be kinds of behavior, strategies, aspects of psychology. They're going to be useful to you in navigating the world you're likely to encounter in the future. I should say these are not only theories now, but there's also quite a bit of evidence. So this is a completely interdisciplinary field. So we gather data from diverse societies. We work with developmental psychologists, gather data on children. You can find these cues in infants as young as 1 year old. So these are reliably developing features of human psychology. Also important is what people to pay attention to. So it's clear that we have biases to pay attention to some kinds of things. People seem particularly interested from a young age in things like information about food, social norms, the dangerousness of animals are some things that have been studied. And finally, when. So when should we rely on culturally learning from others versus our own individual experience? And one of the things that makes humans unique in terms of our cultural learning compared to chimpanzees and other species that social learn is we're heavily reliant. We'll place a lot of weight on something we see other people doing and relatively less weight on our own intuitions and experiences. And as I mentioned, this begins early and it's automatic, it's unconscious, so it's not a conscious decision usually. People are constantly acquiring ideas from their social milieu without realizing it. And we know that it affects all kinds of things. So it affects economic strategies, the adoption of technologies, preferences, so things like fairness towards strangers or temporal discounting parameters, risk parameters, I'm putting this in economist terms, beliefs, epistemological rules. So what counts as evidence is something we acquire culturally from our social milieu. Motivations, emotions or reactions, affective reactions, heuristics, and even something like confidence. So for example, it's often suggested that people are overconfident. It turns out that's heavily affected by social learning and quite variable across societies. Okay, so it's with these kind of pieces of evolved psychology that we can then begin to build models of cultural evolution. And again, this is a highly formalized enterprise where we take the theoretically grounded and empirically tested mechanisms of cultural learning, put them into models, individual level models, and then you can explain why you get cumulative fancy technology, so why innovation goes faster in some populations and not others, fancy tools, rituals. And the thing I'll focus on today is social norms and institutions. But this is the same process that can also give rise to fancy languages, complex grammars, and the kinds of things that characterize human communication. So these are cultural products. Now, the interesting thing is we now have more and more evidence that our minds adapt to the kinds of technologies and the social norms they encounter in the world. So this occurs even in basic processes like visual illusions. So if you study the Mueller-Lyer illusion, which is a classic illusion that cognitive psychology talks about, our susceptibility to it actually varies across populations. Some populations don't see the illusion, and it's strongest in Western populations. Something like self-regulation is heavily influenced by rituals. So societies vary in the kinds of rituals they have, and this affects people's tendencies or ability to self-regulate. Pro-social motivation, so I mentioned cooperation and trust with strangers, seems to be heavily affected by the norms in people's societies. And finally, even things like spatial cognition, so things like distinguishing left and right varies across societies. Not all languages have left and right, so you don't develop the routines and the capacities to do left and right, and that turns out to be a useful tool. Okay, now just a quick point, which I'll come back to in a second, but one of the things that this enterprise suggests is that we need to move away from this dualistic thinking where there's biology on one side and culture on the other. So interacting with these institutions, cultural learning actually changes our brains. So it's biological evolution, but it's non-genetic, because you can see changes in the brain. So we now have cultural neuroscience, so we can measure these things. All right, and then the book is actually interested in this longer term process where these cultural products have shaped our genome. So it's easy to make the case now that you can't understand human genetic evolution without recognizing the presence of culture. And it's affected things like the size of our stomachs and the fact that we have a nuchal ligament, unlike other great apes. So lots of features of human anatomy have been shaped by that. All right, now I'm going to zoom in on social norms in a second. But before I get to that, I just want to make a quick point about humans have experienced this rapid brain expansion in the last 2 million years. So our brains are 3 times bigger than they were 2 million years ago and 3.5 times bigger than chimpanzees. But much of this expansion is a programmable space. It's a space where these capacities to learn from others can actually accumulate all this information so they can drink in all these ideas and heuristics and strategies and biases and whatnot. So neuroscience is now at the point where you can expose learners to models who are making, say, patient or impatient decisions, and you can see the brain changing and the kind of temporal discounting parameter being etched into people's minds through social learning. All right. Okay, so culture and institutions. One of the unfortunate debates that I see as someone coming from cultural evolution and economics is this distinction between institutional explanations on one hand and cultural explanations on the other hand. From the point of view I just laid out, the capacity to learn from others naturally gives rise to social norms. So self-reinforcing stable states where any deviation is going to be incentivized to return back to the behavior. So something like a food taboo or cooperation in food sharing are classic examples. And it gives rise to these social norms when you acquire both the behavior and the standards for judging others. And once you have both of those things sufficiently common in a population, you can lock in on a social norm. It becomes a dynamically stable equilibrium. And one fact that seems to be the case, and there's interesting evolutionary theories about why this might be the case, but people seem to internalize norms. So they live in a world where there's a behavior stabilized by reputational incentives or signal incentives. And this means that people internalize it, and their habitual response is to comply with the social norm rather than always calculating the costs and benefits. There's some research that I summarize in The Secret of Our Success on that. Okay, so how do you get to institutions? So institutions from this perspective are simply sets of interrelated social norms. So a simple example is marriage. Marriage is found in not all, but most human societies, nearly all human societies with a few exceptions. And the social norms are things that cover all kinds of things about the pair bond, so the relationship. So where the couple lives after they get married, who's responsible for various bride payments, how many spouses each member can have, inheritance rules, things like that. So that's an example of an institution. And formal institutions, which sometimes it seems like when economists use the term institutions, they mean formal institutions, are just decisions about the normative behavior, what the group is going to do, made by some kind of decision-making body. So you see this in writing and laws and whatnot. So then at a higher level, and the kind of where it's so important to think about multi-level selection and meso-level processes, is that norms and institutions are stable equilibria, so they're characteristics of groups, and then they can compete. And some groups have social norms and institutions that lead to greater success in intergroup competition. Those are going to tend to spread. Of course, there's lots of other processes affecting which norms get picked, but this can lead to this diffusion of norms that lead to success in intergroup competition. And there's another common intuition, at least I find among many economists, that people are smart and they pick good, sensible norms. But whenever I've tried to test that or look for evidence of that, it seems to be in short supply. Even in simple experiments where you could put people in a social dilemma and have them pick which of various institutions designed by the experimenter they want to go in, most people pick the bad one. So there's not much support for the people are smart view. So if you're thinking about institutions, the place to start is with probably the first and the most primeval of human institutions, which relates to kinship in the family. Most economists, most people, except for anthropologists, wouldn't think of starting with the family because this institution in our society has been reduced down to these small monogamous nuclear families, which are extremely rare in comparative perspective. But in most places, these are the dominant institutions. And lots of in societies, it's the main institution of politics and economics. So our societies kind of shift this and make us not pay enough attention to this institution. To show how these are anchored very much in human biology and features of our evolved psychology that we share with other primates and other apes, kin-based institutions are always built on the fact that across all societies, people tend to help close genealogical relatives. But then what the kinship norms do is they extend this. So a typical kinship system, you'll call your father's brother, you'll also call him father. If he's older than your father, maybe you call him big father. And then there's also small father. So it's extending the primary relatives in an effort to say you treat this person like a father. Lots of cousins are called brothers, and that means they're supposed to be treated like a brother. So it's building and kind of rejiggering various relationships. Another feature of our evolved psychology is pair bonding. So marriage, of course, is built on this pair bonding. Gorillas also pair bond. They build these long-term relationships related to offspring. But marriage norms reinforce that, and they kind of adjust it in various ways. And this is crucial because this allows you to build links between different groups. If you look at a typical hunter-gatherer group, most people aren't related unless you account for affine, so relatives through marriage. And then you can say that most people are related. So it's actually a cultural institution that makes those groups related. And then finally, incest aversion. So like other primates, we have to deal with the problem of inbreeding. Humans have innate mechanisms for dealing with incest aversion, but lots of societies have expanded those and made them into incest taboos. And this affects who you can marry and who you can't, and it structures human social networks. So if you think social networks are important for how people make decisions and interact and see costs and benefits, this is basically doing really ground up work and structuring who's linked to who in social networks. Okay, so my colleagues and I wanted to think about the idea that these kin-based institutions might have a big effect on people's psychology. Because we know from anthropology that there's a tremendous variation in kin-based institutions. So what I've called weird societies, so Western educated, industrialized, and rich and democratic societies, are characterized by these small monogamous nuclear families, whereas most agricultural populations have intense kinship. So they have lots of cousin marriage, polygyny, they have residence patterns about where you live after you get married that connects you with certain relatives. And so if people's minds are adapting to these different worlds, and of course, families and marriage systems are the first institutions that humans encounter when they enter the world, this might have a big effect on how people think. So we put together an anthropological database called the Ethnographic Atlas, and we created a kinship intensity index, so measuring the degree to which these norms interwove the social networks of different populations. Using some techniques we actually took from Nathan Nunn, we mapped the world with these kinship intensity networks. We also took cousin marriage measures from around the world. And what our enterprise was to link this to a wide range of predictions about psychology. So we compiled all the available psychological evidence we could find. If you're interested in this, we published the econometrics in our article in Science. So what we found is that societies that have less intensive kin-based institutions, who tend to have monogamous nuclear families, tend to be highly individualistic. So they tend to focus on themselves, their individual attributes. They think of people as social atoms. They assign dispositional properties. So a person is trusting rather than trusting in a certain context. The individualism may explain why methodological individualism is so common in economics, because most economists come from highly individualistic societies. So this shapes the kind of theories we build. I also apply that to physics. I think it shapes physics. Trust. So this is trust in strangers, the kind of generalized trust. We find that the societies that have these monogamous nuclear families tend to be much higher in this generalized or impersonal trust, but relatively lower in things like nepotism, trust in local family, friends, and community. So there's this difference in the kind of trust we see across societies. Moral universalism varies along the same way. So with the small families being high in moral universalism. A whole bunch of measures of impersonal pro-sociality. We can use global blood donations. We can use public goods game cooperation. It just depends which one you want. Analytic thinking. So this is a basic question of how people approach problems, how they break down and solve them. So in societies with intensive kinship, people tend to think holistically. So they pay attention to backgrounds, they look for relationships, and they explain things through relationships. In more analytic thinking societies, like weird societies, people tend to break things down into individuals, assign properties, and use that to explain things. Conformity, so you can use psychological measures like the Asch conformity test, which is something you'd find in a typical social psychology textbook. You can use survey measures, other kinds of measures, and you find that non-conformity varies with this family measure. Dispositional thinking, same kind of thing. The use of intentions and moral judgments. So the more intensive kinship you have, the less people tend to rely on intentions in judging whether an action is good or bad. Lots of societies rely heavily on outcome. Some, at least in some circumstances, rely only on outcome. So strict liability societies. If you look at the history of Western law, I'm reading secondary sources here, of course, but the argument is made that the focus on intentions and mental states, the careful dissection of mental states, increases beginning in the High Middle Ages, which is when when Western societies tended to develop small families. Patience you can put in there, and even personality structure. So some of you may have heard that there's big five personality structure, and this has been replicated. It turns out it's only been replicated in societies that are highly urbanized. When you go to small scale societies like horticulturalists in the Bolivian Amazon, they don't have the big five personality structure at all. They have the big two, and those two dimensions don't map onto the big five. And you can explain a lot of this by looking at the number of social or occupational niches you see across societies. Here I've featured some maps on individualism and in-group, out-group trust, just because there's a literature within economics linking individualism to things like innovation, so greater individualism, more technological innovation as measured by things like patents, and in-group to out-group trust has been associated with economic growth. Trust has also been associated with greater innovation. So this psychological variation has big economic outcomes. If you buy our science paper, then it means that family structure has a big impact on psychology, which then has a big impact on important economic outcomes. Okay, so some key ideas here. Let me summarize my last slide. So there's strong evidence that populations vary psychologically. The natural next question is, why do they vary psychologically? Here, I've pointed out one kind of institution. We expect there to be many more institutions that affect people's psychology and have co-evolved over time. So in the weirdest people in the world, I not only lay out the evidence for the kinship story that I presented, I use evidence just from China, I use evidence just from India as ways of testing the idea. But I also look at how other things like market competition and market integration affect people's psychology. And there's evidence for those things too. So this has, I think, important implications because it affects the functioning of formal institutions. So something like cousin marriage is highly correlated with people's willingness to engage in protests and demonstrations and voting and all the things that make secular institutions, modern secular institutions work. Just one example. And in the book, I make the case that this psychological change actually precedes the Industrial Revolution and is largely, is important in thinking about it and thinking about what drove the Industrial Revolution. All right, that's it for me.
Thank you very much, Joe. I'd like to ask all three panelists to maybe pick up one point from the other two panels that they'd like to interact with, but I'd also like you to be fairly brief just to try and bring our talks together because I have a number of interesting questions in the chat line. So if you just kind of give a reflective reaction to the other talks, I start with David with the order we started in.
Well, I will keep it brief, and so thank you so much. I love Kate's phrase, we're all developing countries now. The idea that all cultures are mismatched to their current environments, every single one of them needs to change at all scales. And so the question for Joe, for example, is realizing the diversity that exists so that when we begin at any given culture, we really must have an understanding of its history and its current nature, and then go from there. And I wonder, Joe, if you have any maybe examples of successful examples of working with a non-weird nation and communicating with them well enough to, in the first place, with enough sensitivity and perspective, so to make them feel comfortable in the interaction, and then to encourage a process of development, evolution, change, call it what you want. So are there some good examples of positive cultural evolution in non-weird cultures?
Well, so I don't think I have any, I can't think of any cases that would directly address what you're thinking of. I mean, I certainly make the point in The Weirdest People in the World that one of the problems is taking formal institutions that evolved in one society and came to fit the psychological inclinations and preferences and beliefs of that society and transporting them to other places. So there's lots of negative examples where there's misfits between imposed or imported formal institutions.
We call that development.
Right. And then, but of course, using more kind of ethnographic examples, there's certainly lots of cases where a particular group imitated the rituals or legal practices of other groups, and then ended up becoming more successful and spreading at the expense. So one of the examples I use in the book is this small group who's in New Guinea, and they're not doing well, so they decide to copy the most successful group, and they import a bunch of their institutions, and they're able to raise their pig raising and become more prestigious and successful in the community by copying the more successful group in the region. So there are kind of ethnographic cases like that.
Okay, thank you. Kate, do you have a question you'd like to raise for either of the other two speakers?
Yeah, I'll one for David, just the wider question of, given that there are weird people in an ill spectrum, do we all have equal capacity to, do we think, or is there evidence that we all have equal capacity to learn these pro-social skills, or to what extent, are the pro-social skills really actually designed for weird people? Because we're the ones who are lacking them. So that's just a question for David. And then for Joe, the title of your book, I balked, I'll be honest, I balked at the subtitle, which was how weird people became psychologically peculiar and particularly prosperous, because I want to take those maps you've got and layer onto them the national donuts, and I could say, well, are weird societies particularly prosperous, or are they particularly extractive from others and also particularly degenerative of the living world?
I'm fine with all of those things. I just thought it'd be an interesting title.
Okay. And I think that I do think that there's something culturally universal about the dynamics of cooperation. So universal that it's pan-human. I mean, this can be used to understand cooperation in non-human species. So for all the diversity that we've been talking about, which is so important to appreciate, I do think that there ends up being something very core about, especially about people living in small cooperative groups, and what's required, the structure that's required for those groups to function as cooperative units, functioning first and foremost on social control. That's the final point I'll make, is that there's no cooperation and coordination without social control. If you can't actually do something about the bully, the disruptor, the free rider, then forget about it. There will be no cooperative enterprise. And that's been baked into human nature enough. Not that it just spontaneously unfolds, because it's always being tested. It's always being tested. But and that's why it has to be strong. And I think that all humans get that. And then how it unfolds and how it develops, the diversity comes from there.
So can I say more to respond to Kate's? I mean, Kate's still an open question as to how do we explain. So I do this in the last chapter, right? It's not in the subtitle, but it is in the last chapter. Whether you frame the West as particularly prosperous, or you frame it as particularly good at extracting and particularly good at innovating extractive technologies, that still needs to be explained.
Yeah. I'm tempted to intervene here, because yesterday I was at a seminar in my department. I'm in a department of economic history, and it was a survey of the very large literature, the comparative literature about the West and how it got wealthy. Economics is so subdivided, like many disciplines, but the amount of research in economic history covering all of these issues about kin and social groups and their economic success, I think is just a huge resource possibly for these kinds of problems. Joe, let me turn to you. What question would you like to add into the?
So I guess I wanted to ask David. So, here the topic is economics, rebuilding economics or macroeconomics. But do you see this as part of the larger enterprise of building a more integrated human sciences? Like, why is economics even a discipline from your point of view?
Well, I mean, yes. So I think that, and I think the whole trend, at least among the people here, has been a holistic view of economics, which more or less causes economics to merge with all the other disciplines. I'm currently sponsoring a series of conversations titled Advice to an Aspiring Economist, as to what an aspiring economist would do to get educated. And the answer from all of the essays, more or less, is that there's no economics program in the nation or the world, actually, that can do this, because what we do has to be transdisciplinary. And yet, at the same time, there is something. There is ways that disciplines get defined, and so I do think that there's a way to define economics so that it is recognizable as a discipline along with other disciplines. So there's some combination of having an identity. You've got to have an identity. It can't just be a soup, and yet at the same time having that identity be intensely transdisciplinary that we're working towards.
Thank you. I've got a whole set of questions in the chat line here, and I want to try and pick up ones that are particularly relevant to the program section, which is evolutionary macros. So let me pick up a couple of comments from David Tuckett, which start with the question, and then an add-on from him from a later comment, which is, David asks, isn't the fundamental insight of much evolution that accidents have very long-term and are very unexpected effects? And then later on, the observation that today's optimization might mean tomorrow's disaster. So I think there's a kind of the salience of those 2 points. I don't know who would like to take up that point about the accidents of evolution.
Let's have a quick round. I think we can zip through this fast, and I'd like to hear from everyone on that. Joe, would you like to begin? And then, okay.
I'm happy to begin because I have a favorite accident. So in the weirdest people in the world, I make the case that the West ended up on the particular cultural evolutionary trajectory that it did because one branch of Christianity became very concerned about marriage and the family and began expanding incest taboos, outlawing polygyny, regulating inheritance systems. And as this diffuses through Europe, it breaks Europe down into these small monogamous nuclear families. So in some sense, it was the obsession with sex or not having it, in the case of the Catholic Church, that gave rise to Western civilization. So it's kind of it's an interesting religious mutation that has big impacts.
I'll jump in and say that when Paul Samuelson in 1948 wrote a textbook on economics, he was teaching at MIT. He was actually teaching engineering students who had returned from being in service and they wanted to study engineering and they had to learn a little bit of economics on the side. So he drew a big diagram of what the economy looks like, and it looks like radiator pipes plumbed together going in a circle. So you've got the household and you've got the market, and they were buying and selling, and it's the foundations of the circular flow of income diagram that Keynes made such use of to say when you pay households wages, they can buy stuff, and when companies sell stuff, they can employ people. It's incredibly important. But Samuelson drew it looking like this radiator, probably because he was teaching engineering students. So he drew it this series of closed pipes. And this diagram that was kind of useful to his students at the time has had such a long tail of influence because it completely excludes the living world. It treats the economy as a self-contained circular flow, which of course it's fundamentally not. It depends upon energy and resources from the living world. It depends upon unpaid caring work of women, and it depends upon society. And I think that is at the fundament of why people still think it's normal to go, welcome to economics, here's the market. And that's a profound problem.
David, did you want to add in here?
Yeah, so in Jason Potts's talk, he combined several times evolutionary theory with complex systems theory. And so cultural evolution is the cultural evolution of complex systems. Even a very small system is complex. And what that means is that there will almost always be unforeseen consequences of our actions. And we have to take that into account in our policies. This is why our policies must be an evolutionary process. Basically, we have to try stuff out to the best of our knowledge, but then we have to assess it to see what the actual consequences are. And then we have to repeat that process again and again and again. A complex world actually demands a managed process of cultural evolution. But that has to be a highly intentional process. If it's not, then what's going to happen is we're still going to get cultural evolution, but it will almost always result in problems rather than solutions. I mean, Joe described a case where a particular cultural event had happy consequences, very happy consequences for some people at least down the road. But for the most part, we need to be increasing cultural evolution. Human cultural evolution has always had a teleological intentional component. Veblen was right about that, but that intentional component has always collided with other intentions and so on and produced huge unintended component to cultural evolution. But we need to bring the whole thing under intentional control as much as possible, not by top-down management, but by managing the process of cultural evolution.
I guess I'm a bit worried about who the manager is in this kind of framework.
Except to get it again. Yeah.
So Charles Stott asks, is cultural evolution a blind process in the way that natural selection is? Any takers on that one?
I'm happy to take that. So, I mean, it is not always blind, and that's actually irrelevant. I mean, when you build these models, you can have people make future projections. The thing that's interesting, and this relates to the points that were just being made, is that people are terrible at predicting the future. So for lots of things, it's effectively random because people have different beliefs. They're trying different things. In the case I just gave, the Catholic Church thought that God wanted people to not have sex with their cousins. And so it was kind of a public health program to try to get people not to engage in incest that had this big impact. But they had wrong beliefs about the world, and that had big downstream consequences. Measure either way you want.
Yeah, this question is a good example of how evolutionary theory was itself part of the problem. The idea that evolution is always blind, must be blind, thinking of evolution having a purposeful component is taboo. It's one of the biggest taboos in evolutionary science during its gene-centric era. But as soon as you start thinking about human cultural evolution, and frankly, evolution in non-human species, then we realize that's just bullpucky. That evolution often has an intentional component. Look at artificial selection, what Darwin based his theory of natural selection on, by analogy, in which humans are intentionally selecting the traits of domesticated animals, and it turns out each other. The concept of self-domestication is now one of the hottest topics among my colleagues. So cultural evolution is never entirely blind. Veblen was right. It's intensely teleological, and yet at the same time, because it's a complex world and we don't know the true consequences of our actions, then unforeseen consequences are everywhere. So we have to hold those two things in common: a strong intentional component and a very strong unintended component. We have to hold those two things together, and we can do so.
Could I have a quick follow-up?
Yep. Yes.
Just to follow up on David, just as a point of intellectual history, some of the earliest models of cultural evolution included individual learning that was goal-directed. So this has been baked into cultural evolution since Boyd and Richardson 1985.
Okay, thank you. So now there's a question which comes from Diane Elson, but is a kind of generic question which I always feel economists manage to miss out, which is, okay, power. How does one deal with issues of power in these developments of norms? There's been, there was some discussion about free riding and making people behave, but it still sort of slightly avoids the problem of power and where that is and how it's contested. And of course, it's pretty obvious in the kind of animal kingdom, but how do we put it into our cultural evolution question in terms of thinking about the macroeconomy? So thinking about the whole, where does power lie and what does it do in terms of your cultural evolution, or in terms of your donuts cake? Because I was thinking very much about the level the levels being unclear about where power is residing. So maybe either of you could take up this power issue. Kate, would you
Well,
like
I'll just jump in on that point. So power comes in many forms, and one way to challenge power is to reframe. So to refuse to hold the debate in the frame of the power holders in the US. The classic example made well known by, say, George Lakoff is, if you're against tax cuts, don't undertake a debate about tax relief. Like, you'll never win an argument against tax relief because you're reinforcing the frame. So one way to challenge power is to reframe. That's certainly what I'm aiming to do with the work of the Doughnut Economics Action Lab, reframe what prosperity is from endless growth to thriving in balance. And to embed that frame, you need to come with metrics, and you need to come with comparison. So showing Rwanda, Brazil, Australia, we can see something we didn't see before. And you start to shift the ground, saying we are all developing countries now, removes the power of those who say, well, but we're developed. Well, hang on, you're not, because when we framed you like this, you need to be as humble as and ambitious as any other country. So I'll just add that point quickly. That's one way of tackling power, is to reframe where the debate begins. It doesn't mean that the power of finance and ownership has gone, but it means you've invited them back into a room on a different footing, in a different paradigm.
Yeah, Joe.
Yeah. So, I mean, the problem with power, as it's often talked about, is that it's kind of, it's very much airy-fairy. There's no explanation of power. So what cultural evolution, there's many cultural evolutions about power, but they don't tend to use the word power because they're trying to build a bottom-up theory of power. So in small groups, for example, there's lots of work about where prestige comes from. Why are prestigious individuals particularly influential? Why, when they act cooperatively, will others follow along? There's models of the cultural evolution of social stratification. So how is it that you get a stable state where one group gets more of the pie than a lower group? So that's model's been around since 2008. All of these are many models going back to 1992 have individuals who are punishers. So this brings people along through sanctioning, sometimes through group sanctioning, sometimes through the sanctioning of one individual, sometimes through something called pool punishment. So these are all models about the evolution of power. We have models about religion that include a power component, so a multi-level selection. You can easily incorporate power because you can have competition amongst groups, but then you can also have coalitions which are pushing their own. So, I mean, those are just different levels of competition. Peter Turchin has worked on this, looking at the expansion of empires and thinking about why empires break down due to internal power dynamics. So power is widely addressed in the field. It's just not labeled as such because it's otherwise an empty concept.
I'm really interested if I was a political scientist, that power is an empty concept, but maybe that's for another day. Let me go on to another question here. Which is
Mary, if I could I just chip into that? I'll take less than a minute. I think that the core design principles are inherently egalitarian, and they provide a foundation for democratic governance, which is far, far deeper than typical cultural explanations for democratic governance. If there's not equality of participation and privilege and so on, then it simply the group will not function as a cooperative unit. At the same time, there needs to be structure. So we need to distinguish between power taken and power organized, which is structure. So groups need structure. The bigger they are, the more structure they need. But that spirit of communitas and participation gets back to your question, Maria. Who manages? We manage. And if it's done to rather than done with, that's when the problems begin. So I think that all of that needs to be said.
Yeah, I guess, since I'm a historian of economics, I might say that amongst all the wonderful economists whose work I admire, who's been mentioned today already, from Smith to Veblen, the one name that hasn't come up is John Rogers Commons, who was the one economist who really thought a lot about power. So maybe to flag that. Kate, there was a question which I think is particularly for you, which is about the notion of a donut model for non-geographically bounded communities. So the sense in which this is your donut notion is very spatially framed. It doesn't have to be, I think. So I'm wondering what's different if you are thinking about donut models which are not based on spatial communities.
Yeah, so Alexa has raised this as a question. I'm really looking forward to seeing what they've got in mind. But so certainly people interested in food systems have said, we want to use the donut to reimagine food systems because, of course, food systems affect a lot of the social foundations and they affect every single one of the planetary boundaries. So can we use it through that lens? People thinking about energy systems have used it as a frame. There's been actually a wonderful Maori reinterpretation of the donut in New Zealand, which has flipped it inside out. So people have started reimagining it, not about place. It doesn't have to be about a specific place, but that seems to be, we're just following the evolution of what people want to do with it. So we're responding to what people want to do. People are wanting to turn it into a tool for place because places have governance and have communities that converse. But there's no reason why, if somebody finds it useful, it couldn't be used as a lens for thinking about the future of energy, about the future of food, or indeed other ideas that I'm looking forward to hearing what Alexa's got in mind.
Okay, thank you. Amongst all the questions that have been coming in, I guess from the macroeconomy point of view, coming back to the kind of notion of the aggregate, questions about the role, the interaction of the institutions and the outcomes. This is clearly something which macroeconomists have been grappling with in lots of different ways since Keynes thought up the project of macroeconomics, not just him, but in general. So maybe we can finish off with a quick response from each of the panelists on the interaction between the norms, institutions, I mean informal ones, I think here, and the outcomes in terms of thinking about the aggregates, since that's where the macro is focused.
Joe, would you like to begin?
I mean, sure. That's one of the things I'm interested in, and I mean, we can also, I talked about this global variation in family structures. We can use that and put it together with all kinds of economic output measures like light luminosity, and we can predict it showing the family structure. So these things seem to relate directly to the kinds of things that macroeconomists are interested in. The question would be to look at all different kinds of institutions and try to assess the relative contributions.
Great.
So when we're engaging with cities or indeed with companies, using the donut as a starting point, it very quickly gets to the question we need to say, look, let me say of a company, it doesn't matter. We're not so focused on the design of your products. We want to talk about the design of your institutions. And again, the design of a national government, city government, or a company. There's 5 design traits that we always talk about, and I get these from the brilliant thinker Marjorie Kelly. The first is your purpose. Why? Back to where we began, the teleological. Why do you exist? What are you in service of? Second, your network. So what are your relationships with your citizens, your consumers, your producers, your allies? How are you in relation with those, and how do they enable you to achieve that purpose? And of course, all the pro-social skills come in there. Third, how do you govern? Who's in the room? Who's at the table when decisions are made? Principles, rules, practice, culture of governance, the incentives, the metrics of what success looks like. So those are the easy ones. Your purpose, networks, and governance. Then going deeper, how are you owned? So at the city level, how is the land owned? How is the housing owned? How is the data owned? At the company level, how is your enterprise owned? Because that takes us down to the deepest design traits, which is how are you financed? It comes back to a question that Diane raised earlier about cities and finance. How are you financed? Where's the finance coming from, and what is it demanding? And what are you doing with the finance that you earn? And I think if we want to redesign any particular institution, it's the redesign of finance. It's clearly a cultural construct. It should be in service to humanity in a thriving world. And I think the current design of finance does a lot of the opposite of that. So you always find, under the root of many, many issues, it's the design of finance.
Yeah. The cut between finance and economics is, again, problematic. David.
So I'll end with a call for the need for iteration, that what's needed is a bit like weather forecasting. The weather is a very complex physical system, and to predict it, we need to gather data, we need to use our models, multiple models, and then we need to increase the fit by the very rapid iteration between model building and testing against data. I think we need to do that for our social systems. When we try things out, our policies out, we need to be able to assess them. We need to assess them at the whole system level, and then that needs to feed back upon what we do next. So it's possible to describe that without using the word evolution, but in fact, what is that but an managed evolutionary process? And I think to think about it explicitly as a managed form of cultural evolution and the need for it to be multi-level, meso in addition, and meso being multiple level, then that's what we need to be reaching for.
Okay, so I'd like to thank all the speakers again, Kate, Joe, and David. Thank David for setting up the panel. Thank you very much. It's been a great session. And I'd like to thank all those who contributed questions into the chat. I'm sorry I didn't get to all of them, but some of them got answered by other people in the chat line. So it's obviously a great participatory event. Thank you very much. I'll hand back now to Angus.
Mary, thank you very much indeed. And can I also just pass my thanks on to Kate, Joe, and in particular David for setting up the panel. For a simple economist, that was quite a mind-stretching discussion, which is going to take me some time to digest. Thank you all very much. And thank you, as you quite rightly said, Mary, to the many people who have contributed in the chat. So it's great to have a conversation this afternoon. So that brings us to the end of the first day of our conference. Tomorrow we start off at 9:30, where the host will be William Hines from the New Approaches to Economic Challenges at the OECD. And our policy speaker will be Andy Haldane, the Chief Economist at the Bank of England. And then we have three panels, first on radical uncertainty, and then on what disequilibrium macroeconomics might look like, and finally on the causes and cures for economic instability. So I very much hope you can join us tomorrow. Thank you very much indeed for joining us. Thank you, Mary, and thank you again to the panelists very much indeed. Have a good afternoon.